Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, where we talk about all things fuel for all kinds of people. I am your host, Eric Bjornstad, and I am your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. So what are we going to talk about on today's episode of the podcast? Well, a while back, we talked about some of the microbial myths that are commonly held in the industry. These are mistaken or outdated beliefs that even fuel professionals still have, and they're holding on to them in a way that sometimes, if we do that, it can cause us to make expensive mistakes in the way that we take care of our fuel and the things that use them. So the first microbial myth that we talked about in that previous episode was the idea that getting rid of water, or simply keeping water out of a storage tank or a distribution system, that will prevent microbial growth or even make an existing microbial contamination go away. Now, if you missed that discussion, just check back to episode 36 to get yourself up to speed. Today, we're going to focus on a different microbial myth, one that is especially, shall we say, apropos for us being in the middle of the cold winter months as we are. And that is the myth that microbes don't grow in cold weather. See, people don't tend to worry about microbial growth in the winter months, almost as if they think that microbes stop multiplying when the temperatures drop. So why is that? Why do people hold that, somewhat mistaken idea? Well, to be fair, microbial growth does tend to be seen more often in the in the warmer months. And it is a well-known fact that common microbes tend to grow better when there's more heat around. But even acknowledging those truths, does that really mean that microbes can't grow in cold weather? Well, the easy answer to that is, of course, it doesn't mean that. Of course, microbes can grow in cold weather. And for a number of reasons, we're going to unpack this myth. And we're going to talk about at least a couple of those reasons to try to get a better understanding of this myth and what the real truth of the situation is. So, for one thing, when we talk about microbes growing in cold weather, and we're saying that that microbial problems can develop in colder temperatures. And so why is that? Well, first reason is, there are an estimated, 1 trillion microbial species they estimate on planet Earth. And so far, we've only identified and cataloged maybe about 10 million of those. So a really small percentage. And one thing that we find, and that we're continuing to find as we find more and more of these microbial species, is that there are microbial species and strains that will grow literally everywhere under any conditions that you want to name. There are lots of different microbes, for example, that grow under the sea, where there's no oxygen, there's extremely high pressures, and there's really, really low temperatures. At the same time, there are microbes who grow under the sea, but near geothermal vents, where you've got no oxygen and high pressure, but you've got tremendously high temperatures. There's some that like growing under those conditions. Some microbial species prefer to be in the presence of oxygen. Some anaerobic ones don't like to be in the presence of oxygen. Some microbial species even like being in high sulfur environments. And this, despite the mistaken notion held for years that they would call sulfur a natural biocide. So these types of bacteria that like to grow in high sulfur environments, in direct contradiction of that logic, they include the sulfate reducing bacteria that are linked to big problems in many kinds of systems. So for virtually any kind of condition you want to name, there are microbial species that like that particular set of conditions. So to think that any microbes, even if you're talking about the kinds of microbes typically found in tanks and fuel distribution systems, the thought that any kinds of microbes would simply stop growing because the temperatures are lower, well, that would be a little bit of a mistake. Now, to the issue of microbes just not multiplying in the cold, generally speaking, it's not That isn't the case of when we say that, we're not talking about microbes, being killed by the cold. Although that does happen if you have some microbial species that like warmer temperatures, some of those might die off if you take them and you move them to a colder environment all of a sudden. But it's not really a case for most of them that microbes are killed off when the temperatures drop. Kind of in the same way as it's not like the case where you take an anaerobic microbe, that is a microbe that does not like oxygen, and you move that into an oxygen-rich atmosphere. That actually would kill off those anaerobic microbes. Well, this is not like that. What this is, when we say that microbial growth slows down in the cold, what we really mean is that the activity, their metabolic activity, the microbial activity slows down in the cold. But that's not the same as saying the cold killed them. They're still being active in their environment. And to that earlier point we made a couple minutes ago, that there are plenty of microbes that do like any kind of condition that you want. There are significant numbers or types of microbes that not only will survive, but they will thrive in colder environments. Now, as a general classification, microbes that like the cold, they're called psychrophiles or psychrophils. And that also stands for cold-loving microbes, psychrophils. And these microbes, these psychrophils, are microbes that have adapted to live in environments, cold environments, that would be inhospitable for many other organisms due to those low temperatures. So optimally, psychrophils, their sweet spot in terms of temperature that they like to be at is below 59 degrees Fahrenheit, and it can go all the way down to freezing or below. And psychrophils are found in various cold environments, Arctic and Antarctic regions. They can be found in deep sea waters where it gets pretty darn cold down there. They're found in alpine environments, gets cold up there. And they're also found in what we would classify as permanently cold soils. We're talking about the tundra, and we're talking about the permafrost. You can find plenty of species of psychrophile microbes in those really cold types of environments. So it is definitely not the case that there are not plenty of types of microbes that thrive in cold weather. There are plenty of them that do. Now, as a rule, when you talk about microbes, one of the advantages that microbes have as a living organism on planet Earth, one of the advantages that microbes inherently have is that they adapt easily. So they tend to evolve various biological adaptations pretty easily that enable them to survive and thrive in whatever situation they're presented in. And so psychrophiles, that's what they have done. They have evolved various biological adaptations to help them thrive in cold temperatures. What are some of these? Well, they have found that they've been able to do things like they produce certain enzymes that remain functional at low, cold temperatures. Enzymes tend to be things that are essential for metabolic processes, so that's what they've done. The enzymes that they use are functional at lower temperatures than other kinds of organisms' enzymes in their cells. They also have cell membranes in the walls of these sarcophiles contain high levels of unsaturated fatty acids. And what that does for them is it helps those membranes to maintain fluidity in cold conditions. So basically, they don't freeze and they don't die. And then some psychrophiles even will produce antifreeze proteins that prevent the formation of ice crystals within their cells that otherwise would damage their cellular structures and kill them. So those are some of the biological adaptations that these microbes have developed over time to help them grow and thrive in cold conditions that would hinder other types of organisms. Okay. Now, of course, we do have to realize that while there are lots of microbes, psychrophile microbes that do well in the cold, just as we've been talking about, we do have to realize and acknowledge that not all microbes that would be expected to cause or be associated with causing problems in fuel distribution systems, not all of those cold weather organisms would tend to cause problems. I mean, we don't want to give the impression that cold doesn't hinder some of the ones that are most responsible for system contamination situations, all right? But there are still plenty of psychrophilic cold weather bacteria and fungal species that do cause problems in fuel distribution systems in the cold. So, on the bacteria side, there are certain kinds of bacteria that thrive in cold environments. And they'll do things like they'll produce corrosive substances as their metabolic byproducts that will cause damage to systems. One big class of bacteria that you have to mention in this context, what they call the sulfate reducing bacteria, or the SRBs. Sulfate reducing bacteria are particularly known, for causing corrosion in cold weather. They will feed on things that have sulfur, and so they'll reduce sulfate molecules. They're basically metabolically processed sulfate molecules, SO3s and SO2s, and they'll eat them basically, and they'll produce hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide, H2S, is a corrosive and extremely toxic gas. Now, SRBs, sulfate reducing bacteria, will do this in oxygen-free conditions, such as the conditions you find down towards the bottom of the tank under the fuel line. Plenty of those kinds of conditions are found in fuel storage and distribution systems. And so when you get into cold conditions and you have a fuel storage or a fuel distribution system in a cold environment, it's very likely, in terms of, can I expect problems to happen? Well, it's very common to find sulfate reducing bacteria in those situations. And when you do find those, it's very common for those to cause problems in cold weather. So that's on the bacterial side. Now, on the fungal side, many kinds of fungi, which we're talking about yeasts and we're talking about molds, they're also involved in corrosion, and they love the cold just as much as certain kinds of bacteria do. They will produce acids as metabolic waste, just like certain kinds of bacteria will do. Additionally, though, the fungal growths have physical structures that are associated with them. Fungi will produce these little tentacles as they grow. The scientific name for those are it's called hyphae. I believe I'm saying that correctly. HYPHAI, hyphae, or hyphae, however you pronounce it. So as these cold-loving fungal organisms grow, those physical tentacles that they make, they'll do a couple of different things. First thing they'll do is they'll trap moisture and other corrosive agents kind of in a web, right? And they'll trap those against solid tank surfaces. And when you get moisture and you get corrosive substances trapped against solid surfaces, you're going to get corrosion damage in that area. The other thing is, especially if you have a fiberglass tank, fungal organisms, when they're putting out these hyphae tentacles, the hyphae tentacles will actually penetrate into the fiberglass matrix, and they will actually start to damage it. They will actually break that up and cause damage of that fiberglass. Again, all of these are cold temperature loving species that do this. So we've established there's no shortage of cold weather microbial species that cause problems in our fuel systems. One other thing that we need to talk about, though, is we need to acknowledge not just the relationship with all of these cold weather loving microbes. We need to talk about the relationship between cold weather and the issue of water. One of the reasons that microbes can grow well in cold weather is that in terms of having what they need to live, it's typically all available to them under cold conditions. And what we mean is, what do they normally need? Well, typically, they'll need at least two big things. They'll need organic compounds to feed off of. Well, that would come from the fuel that's in there. The other thing they typically will need, you can probably guess what that is they will need water. And even at low temperatures, because water is present in these kinds of systems, these microbes, these cold weather loving microbes, tend to find everything that they need to grow and thrive. They find the nutrients they need from the organic fuels. They find anaerobic conditions under the fuel line if these are anaerobic microbes that we're talking about. And they find plenty of water. And if they have all of those things, these psychrophilic microbes easily have enough to proliferate, grow, multiply, and contribute to corrosion problems. Now, let's look a little bit more closely at the water issue, because all we've said to this point is that, yeah, there's water in cold weather. Well, we need to explain that a little more, because what we need to point out is that cold weather, cold temperatures, enhances the condensation phenomenon in fuel systems. And because that's true, that means that there's often more water present for microbes to use than you would think. Now remember, condensation is this idea where water vapor that is normally dissolved in the air, it's present in the air, this water vapor becomes insoluble and turns into liquid water on solid surfaces. We've all seen that happen in real life. Everybody is probably familiar with the after effects of condensation. It's not a hard concept to grasp, right? Now, when this happens, when that water vapor turns into liquid water on whatever solid surface, when this happens and how much it happens is a function of the, shall we say, the interrelationship between two things: temperature and humidity level in the air. So, humidity level. Remember when we talk about humidity let's say you're talking about the weather. The weatherman says, we've got 70% humidity out there. Well, he's talking about relative humidity. Relative humidity is actually the percentage of water vapor in the air at a specific temperature compared to the maximum amount of water vapor the air can hold at that temperature. That's why as you get up towards, into the 90s and you move up towards 100%, if you're to hit 100%, that air is not going to be able to hold any more water vapor out, and something's going to happen. Probably rain, right? So you've got humidity on the one hand. In order for condensation to happen, there has to be water vapor present in the air in order for condensation to happen, right? Stands to reason. The second thing that plays a role is that temperature factor. As a rule, and this is important to understand because this is going to relate to the cold weather explanation. As a general rule, as air temperature decreases, gets colder, that air's capacity to hold water vapor also goes down. In other words, cold air cannot hold as much water vapor as warm air can. Cooler air holds less moisture compared to warmer air. That is an important fact to remember when we start talking about cold weather's impact on microbial levels. And when at the same time, we also acknowledge, or we say this with the acknowledgement, that microbes need that moisture to grow. So, condensation happens when that air cools down to the point where it can't hold all the moisture that it contains. Now, you may have heard this term, if you're watching the weather, you listen to meteorologists, sometimes they'll reference something called the dew point. So the temperature, the point at which the air has cooled down to the point where it can't hold the moisture that it holds, that's the dew point. If the temperature drops below the dew point, remember, as it drops below, it's able to hold less moisture. So that moisture now is released from the air in the form of condensation. Now, obviously, because dew point is related to temperature getting colder, this condensation phenomenon is going to happen more easily in a colder climate, even taking into account that colder climates can tend to have less humidity in them. Colder climates, as a general rule, are more likely to be have temperatures below the dew point of the air, which means condensation is more likely to happen in cold weather. Now, How does this affect fuel storage tanks? Well, as the air temperature inside that tank drops, the air in that tank, of course, is going to cool along with it. And if that air is humid, if it has any water vapor in it, the cooling can cause it to reach its dew point, which leads to condensation happening where? On the solid surfaces inside that tank, on the inside walls of that tank and other solid surfaces. And so the water condenses on those surfaces, it accumulates and it runs down and it settles at the bottom of the tank because water is heavier than fuel. And so you get this gradual buildup of a water phase on the bottom of the tank. Anytime there's water down there, you've got an environment that's conducive to microbial growth. So this kind of condensation scenario happens a lot more often with outdoor systems than it does with indoor systems because temperatures are more stable indoors. Outdoors, you have a lot greater swing in temperature because you're going from morning to evening, and there's a temperature difference there. And depending on how high this temperature swing is, that can often lead to condensation developing. So all of this stuff we're talking about should help us see that cold weather contributes pretty heavily to providing microbes with the things that they need to grow and cause problems. And that belies this, again, microbial myth that microbes don't grow or cause problems in cold weather, right? Now, another fact that belies that idea that microbes can't grow and cause problems in cold weather is that there have been plenty of instances in the real world where microbially induced corrosion, or sometimes you'll see it referenced as MIC or MIC. There have been plenty of instances of MIC corrosion being seen in fuel distribution systems in really cold climates. So, one notable instance of this that you could just pick out is the pipeline incident that happened in the Arctic. It gets pretty cold in the Arctic, right? In the Arctic in 2006, there was a major pipeline leak. And it caused what's been known for posterity as the Prudhoe Bay oil spill. Now, this is in Alaska, again, up, where it gets really cold up in the Arctic. And what they found was this leak was caused by a hole in the pipeline that resulted from corrosion developing that was likely linked to microbial activity. And the results of the Prudhoe Bay oil spill were you had over 200,000 gallons of crude oil were spilled, which made it up to that point the largest oil spill on Alaska's North Slope up to that time. And it resulted in some pretty serious consequences for the people involved. BP Exploration were the ones that were in charge of taking care of the pipeline. Well, they were found liable for essentially not doing what they needed to in taking care of it. So they were fined for negligent discharge of oil, like $20 million. They were fined another $25 million as a civil penalty. And then they had to pay part of a collective payment of like $250 million related to cleaning up the incident, the costs of shutting down the pipeline, all that kind of stuff. So this was a pretty expensive situation that was linked to microbial damage that all happened in cold weather. Now, just beyond this one example, though, because that's just one example, but the oil and gas industry, which has a lot at stake in staying on top of this situation, the oil and gas industry has for years been doing extensive research into the prevalence and the impact of microbial corrosion in cold climates. They, of course, tend to focus on oil and gas pipelines, but it's still the findings that they found are still applicable to storage systems as well. And what we call them, sometimes you'll hear them referred to as the upstream oil and gas. What the upstream oil and gas industries through their studies have found is that microbial corrosion can be a significant factor in pipeline corrosion in cold environments. So they have long ago moved past this myth that cold weather somehow immunizes systems from microbial concerns. And if those folks realize that this is true, then perhaps it might be a mistake for us to assume that we're immune from that concern just because we're not them, right? So, to recap up to this point, what have we found? Well, we know that cold weather enhances condensation situations, which gives microbes one of the essential things that they need to cause problems. Okay, we know that. We also know that parties with the largest financial stakes in this situation, the upstream oil and gas giants like BP, Shell, ExxonMobil, they know that microbial corrosion and microbial contamination are big problems in the winter, big problems in cold weather. But what does all this mean for you? Okay, we said all of this to say that as we're now in the winter months now, all of this points to the realization that it would be a mistake for us to get lax on our fuel condition monitoring just because of some mistaken notion that that the cold weather is going to make us safe from microbial problems in our systems. So the recommendation would be, if we all acknowledge that as true, the recommendation is keep doing your normal fuel monitoring in the wintertime. So in the summertime, if you check your fuel, once a month or whatever, stay on schedule. Don't just stop because the winter's there and you think that you don't need to do it. Keep doing your normal fuel monitoring into the wintertime. Check your fuel's condition to monitor for any changes. And what you're really looking for is you are looking for signs of microbial activity, changes in the fuel's condition. If you happen to run any what we would call mission critical test slates, but test slates that you should run at least once a year that feature stability and cetane, and they also would hopefully feature an acid number test, and maybe you notice your acid number going up. That can be a sign that you've got microbial activity going on. Even better would be if you do a microbial test sometime in the winter, because the results of a microbial test, like an ATP test, those would give you a direct picture as to whether you've got microbes establishing themselves in your system at a time when, really frankly, you might normally have forgotten about them because, hey, it's cold outside, right? Another thing to remember too, even though every system is a little bit different, and this speaks to the reason why you should continue to do this. Now, the general rule of thumb here is that it can take as little as 4 to 6 months for a microbial situation to start, develop, and then start giving you visible signs of corrosion damage in your system. All it takes is 4 to 6 months of not knowing that that problem is there. And if that starts, let's say, in the fall, and you're not paying attention in the winter because you don't think you have to, well, those winter months, October, November, December, January, February, into March, now you're going on 6 months. And so that microbial contamination has been developing during that time. And because you haven't checked your system all winter, you've basically given those microbes a head start all through that time. But if you do what we recommended and you check your system during the winter, you're going to catch that problem and you're going to be able to head that off and, maybe save yourself some money, save yourself some headaches. And besides, you're probably already going to be keeping an eye on your system if it's stored diesel, then you're probably going to be keeping an eye on it because of cold flow and fuel gelling concerns, right? So just keep an eye out for microbes as well. Now, if you do find that you have a microbial contamination developing in your system in the cold weather months, that's pretty easy to treat. Just treat your system with biocide, because most biocide chemistries, whether it's the thiocyanate like Belicide, it's the MBO chemistries like Clear Kill, most of them don't lose any effectiveness in the cold weather. So if you do find a microbial problem in your system, you can treat it with biocide. That biocide is going to knock that contamination out, the winter temperatures aren't going to reduce the biocide's ability to work. So that's good news. So to review, what have we talked about? Well, point number one, it is very certainly a microbial myth that microbes don't grow in cold weather, and it is definitely not true that the winter months insulate you, no pun intended, from microbial problems in your system. We also found out that the cold weather actually makes it more likely for you to develop water issues from condensation. And there are plenty of species of cold-loving, what we call psychrophilic microbes that can be found causing problems in fuel distribution systems and storage tanks. So you want to keep up your best practice monitoring that hopefully you're doing. And if you do that, you can have confidence that if you do find a problem, you treat the problem with biocide in the winter, that biocide is going to work just fine. And so that's going to do it for today's episode of the Pulse Show podcast. Check the show notes for links and information on some of the things that we talked about today. And as always, if you haven't done it already, take a moment and subscribe to the podcast using your favorite podcast delivery vehicle, whether that's iTunes, Amazon Podcasts, Stitcher, even Android systems like, let's say, Podcast Addict, which is the one that I personally tend to use. It also helps if you would give us a good rating as well, as ratings really help with those pesky system algorithms that like to look at those. So, thanks for joining us today for today's episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.